S7E7 of Voices of CX podcast, still bringing you the best thought leaders, practitioners, and academics of the industry, but this time with a renewed focus on the human touch. Empathy is our key word, and we're going all out on discussing how conversations can reshape experiences and your business inside and out. No matter how big your business is, what your challenges are, or your industry, connecting with your customers and their decisions is essential to leading through empathy. Welcome back. We are on episode 7 of Voices of Customer Experience podcast. And today I am joined by Fabrice Martin. He is the CPO of Clarabridge. Clarebridges is a really cool tech company, very similar to Worthix. So I'm really happy to have Fabrice on here today. Hey, Fabrice.
Hi, Mary. How are you?
It's great to have you. Thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure. And chapter 7 is a good number to be in.
Yeah. So I'm going to start off this episode giving you a chance to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them a little bit about how your career progressed to the moment that you are today.
Excellent. Well, thanks for the introduction. And first of all, my pleasure. It's really great to be with you and with your audience today on this chilly day here in Washington, D.C. This is where I'm based. So I'm originally from Mexico. I studied computer engineering in Mexico, and was hired in the late 90s to come into the US to work for a software company. So I started my career as a programmer in some of the heavy algorithmic areas of that company. It was a business intelligence company. And what I worked on was an SQL generation engine. So we would feed it objects and clicks and abstractions, and it would generate SQL programs to go on query what were the largest databases back in that time. So did the engineering thing for 5 or 6 years. Then I noticed that I really liked the business side of the shop as well. I was very interested in understanding how customers were using our product, what new features they wanted and why. And little by little, that pulled me more and more into product management, which is ultimately what I do today. In that same company, I moved to the product management side, and then did a startup. I studied an MBA to kind of fine-tune my business skills. And here I am, a few years later as Chief Product Officer here at Clarabridge. So it's been a fun ride, and I love that crossroads of software, high technology, analytics, and business. That's where I think the action is, and where I love to work.
So do I, but don't take my word for it. I work at the exact same type of company. So
that's awesome.
So tell me a little bit about Clarabridge and Clarabridge's mission with its technology. It was pretty revolutionary and groundbreaking when it came out, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. We have similar philosophies and similar approaches between Worthix and Clarabridge, and it is to apply AI, apply natural language processing to improve customer experience, right? So the way we see it, our philosophy is that we want to let our customers, and those tend to be large B2C companies in different verticals, maybe healthcare, financial services, CPG, retail, online retail mostly. And we want them to understand very clearly their customers' voices, right? What are they telling them? Why are they expressing feedback? It could be good feedback, bad feedback. What do they want? We let those companies understand that feedback at very large scale. Then we provide analytics to understand that feedback. And that feedback, by the way, could be surveys, it could be online social posts, for example, or ratings and reviews. It could be chats, emails, calls. We all consider all of that feedback. We bring it into Clarabridge, make sense of it through analytics and natural language processing and understanding. And then we provide reporting tools, analytics tools, workflows that enable those companies to respond, to improve product, to improve marketing, improve services, improve brand. So again, improve customer experience in general.
So the cool thing for me about Clarebridge is that anything can be feedback, right? Like you can pick up, you can scour the web or even your databases internally or your call logs from your contact centers or customer service departments, and everything is feedback, right?
Exactly. It's a very interesting point that you make. Every conversation, usually feedback tends to be categorized as solicited feedback or unsolicited feedback, right?
Okay.
Solicited feedback is where the company is proactively asking for feedback, and it can be a survey, it can be, sometimes in a video format or audio format or electronic forms, right? But there's also unsolicited feedback, right? So it's stuff, conversations, posts that customers are putting out there in the internet or through a contact center and expressing opinions, desires about a specific brand. So it is just as important, in my opinion, for companies to be listening to that other feedback, the unsolicited one, because it is something that a customer expressed and chose to express without any bias. They just decided to put a great review, for example. So why not learn what it has to say, right?
Do you find that with unstructured data, um, you tend to pick up on a lot of positive feedback that you don't necessarily get from solicited feedback? Do you feel like in solicited feedback, when people have a problem, they tend to focus on that problem, or they tend to focus on the more recent interactions they had with a brand? Whereas on social media, you can pick up on nuances that you might not necessarily get when solicited.
That's an interesting question. I think uh, there's definitely well, actually, let me step back. It depends a lot on the type of source, right? Some sources can be super noisy, right? If for example, we try to fish out information about a company on Twitter, uh, 95%, probably even more, is going to be noise that doesn't really carry that much signal, that much information, right? But you're going to find some good nuggets there. And that's where the natural language processing technology is so important, because it can let you filter out the noise and get to the signal. Um, Other types of channels, for example, the contact center, right, are super rich in terms of information, right? Because when the customer is calling or chatting or writing an email to the company, the customer needs something, wants something, right? And you have to pay attention, and the signal to noise ratio is going to be very high, because again, there's the full intent of the customer. They're making their best effort to express what they want or what they need when they need it, right? Because they have that interest of getting something from the company. So very important to listen. And then you have the historical aspect. You can look at one individual communication from a customer, but if you look at their entire historical, then you start seeing patterns, you start seeing needs, and you start predicting, if we get into technology terms, better what that customer might ultimately want or need from you. And then you can look at other customers like that one and start extrapolating, and it becomes really interesting.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, how do you guys work with like emotion? Is that something that you're able to gauge with your technology? So for instance, how the customer feels when they're giving that feedback?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the why this is important is because, again, we're all about customer experience, and there's three key pillars. This is a framework I really like about customer experience. It's effectiveness, ease, and emotion, right? The three E's of customer experience. And this is a term that Forrester coined. I didn't come up with it, but it's one that I use quite often. Effectiveness is, if you're a company and you're providing a service or a product, how effective are you at providing value? How effective are you at giving the customer what they need, right? So you have to be good at that if you're going to be a long-term business. Then ease is, okay, your product is great, it provides value to the customer, but are you making it easy for that customer to do business with you, right? If you make it very hard, you're going to lose the loyalty of your customers. And there's plenty of studies around that. And the third one is emotion, right? So you provide a great product, you make it easy for customers to do business with you. Third one, you make them feel great about doing business with you, right? If you do those three really well, you are a champion company. You're the best of the best, right? So that's the why. That's why effort, ease, and emotion are important in customer experience. And how we do it using AI, using technology, is we focus mainly on language, right? So the way sentences are structured, the way words are used, will denote a certain level of emotion. So if I tell you, um, you know, uh, I'm very frustrated with the way your website works or doesn't work, that expresses a high degree of one emotion, frustration, and it's intense, right? I'm very frustrated, right? So that can be one way to get emotions. And then you can tease out different emotions. We have models about with 50 different emotions: love, anger, frustration, surprise. And it's interesting. Some of the emotions, like surprise, can be positive or negative. You can be pleasantly surprised, or you can be horribly surprised or
Right.
disappointed, right? So those subtleties in language are very important as well.
How about profanity?
Oh, very associated with emotions. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a
But
great
like
point,
it
right?
can be negative or positive. Like I'm the
Yes.
world's biggest potty mouth. The people who listen to this podcast regularly know this. But so I'll express profanity when I'm super happy, when I'm super sad, when I'm frustrated, when I'm annoyed. Like I've got
Yeah,
multiple uses. So like how does the NLP do that? Like use like just the
that's
word itself.
I love that question. Love that question, Mary. So we call those modifiers, right?
Oh,
So
that's a nice
if I say
word.
yes, yes. And by the way, modifiers don't have to necessarily be profanity, but let's say uh, your podcast is great, right? So that's one piece of feedback that you'll take. And by the way, it is. So then if I say, your podcast is not great, right? The
Okay.
not is a modifier that completely changes the sense, right? So we keep track of those. And by understanding semantics, by understanding grammar, we can understand where that is going. And now if I said, oh, wow, your podcast is freaking amazing, right? And notice that I changed the profanity there, it denoted the same emotion that I like the podcast, but I said it's freaking amazing. So the modifier made that intensity of the emotion and of the feedback that much higher, more intense, right? So that's how we apply modifiers to sense and frankly understand the meaning of feedback and of conversations in general.
And was there, I mean, I imagine that a lot of training went into the module in order to be able to grasp these subtleties of the language.
Yeah,
Is there training that goes into like exclamations, like what the
absolutely.
freak?
Exactly. And you'll notice that profanity can go in a good way or a bad way, right?
Yeah.
When I said this is freaking awesome, it's very positive, right?
Mhm.
So profanity can also, context will provide you whether something is positive or negative.
Right.
Now, in terms of the training, um, there's a few factors. It is important to understand the words and the sentences and keep them updated. So we use several techniques to refresh those words, right? And to make sure that we keep them current. We do that in multiple languages. So it's
Mhm.
also important to understand the subtleties of the language. For example, people in the UK, if they use a word, the same word as in the US, it could be really intense based on their culture, right? There's cultural subtleties as well versus here in the US. So you also have to be aware of who's speaking, and that context will give you a lot of hints about how to interpret profanity, modifiers, any type of sentiment or feedback.
And when it
I don't know
comes
if I answered your question really.
well, no, that it was more about training the machine, right? The different ways to train. So like, how do you train for regionalism even within the US? So if you consider the English language and you take colonial English, let's say, so Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc., versus from the United Kingdom proper versus the US. That's one thing. But then even within the US, you have certain expressions that are super duper regional, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
how are you able to train the machine to notice almost, I'm going to say, cultural subtleties of the language or idiomatic expressions, for instance?
Right. Great question. And there's a limit to how much you can train any algorithm, right? There's the tension between precision and recall, and not to get too nerdy here, but the more precise you make an algorithm to understand certain words and subtleties, the less recall it's going to have, right? Recall, you can think of it as a net of how much language you can capture. The more precise you make it, the less language you're going to capture with that, right? So there's a trade-off, and we try to strike the fine balance where we get you enough precision, enough understanding, but broad coverage, right? So we take a very specific approach, which we call a hybrid approach, right? So there's only so much you can do through training an algorithm. Eventually, there's a point where somebody needs to modify it or override it, right? So that modification or ability to override is based on rules, right? So somebody can create a rule. If this word is pronounced or mentioned, then change the rule and bias it more towards, I don't know, negative sentiment, right?
Sure.
So that hybrid model is what allows us to override the machine and the training, if you want.
So you started getting really technical, and that's when I started getting really happy, because that's when it gets interesting for me. Like, we can't make it too technical, but slightly technical is interesting, because it kind of explains a lot of the mystery behind what people consider to be AI. You know, people are like AI, and they start imagining the freaking Terminator or some like weird robot with like alien-like figures, right? But in general, what do you, Fabrice, consider AI? You.
So for the domain that we're talking about, which is customer experience, I see it as a way to give analysts and businesses superpowers, right? They can understand. Actually, if I take a step back, imagine no AI and no technology like the one that we're talking about. We're back to paper forms. After you have an experience, they would have to be scanned or manually transcribed, and then somebody would try to make sense of, I don't know, maybe 1,000, 10,000 pieces of feedback, right? And that was it. That was the capability that a person or a team of analysts could have. Now, with, again, social media, millions of conversations flowing through chats, through emails, through contact centers, millions of surveys circulating around the world, it's just not humanly possible to process that information, but it is there. And if you want to successfully provide the experiences that your customers want, the products that you need to offer so that the competition doesn't beat you, you have to tap into that information. You have to listen. And the only way is with this type of technology, with AI. So again, I see it as a way to augment your capacity and give you superpowers in some way.
A lot of people talk about, when it comes to machine learning, especially with natural language processing that involves training the machine,
Mhm.
when you have to be very, very careful at the start, because any sort of bias at the beginning may be imperceptible, but as time goes by, that curve starts getting more and more clear. And at some point, I remember when the first company started dabbling a little bit more in that, they sometimes had to reset entirely because the machine had gone really far off course. So how do you guys avoid
Absolutely.
that type of situation?
Great question. And I think I go back to that hybrid
Mhm.
model, right? Where there's always the ability to change a rule or point the machine in a completely different way.
Mhm.
So that is a way to enable or to fight that bias that could have been inherent in the data that you use for training or for modeling. And certain algorithms we have, for example, algorithms that will be used to score, for example, a phone conversation, right? This is very common in contact centers. um, One way to score how a conversation went is by sending a survey to the customer that called after the call and say, okay, well, how would you rate that conversation, right? From 0 to 10 or 1 to 10. Was it great? Was it not great? And then give us some other feedback, right? That's one way.
Mhm.
Uh, the other way, one of the issues with that way is that there's very low response rates, right?
Mhm.
Very, very low response rates. So probably 95 to 98% of those conversations go unscored or unrated. And if an agent is going to be evaluated or even compensated based on that score, it seems kind of unfair, right? That
Super.
maybe it was that one call where things didn't go that well, but that customer filled the survey and you're
Especially
getting
because
dinged.
people go the extra mile when they're angry, right?
Exactly, exactly. Speaking of emotion, right? So we think that we have a better approach, which is, well, let's score the conversation itself. Let's look for patterns of emotion, of effort, of empathy from the agent, from the customer, and try to come up with a set of rules that can transparently, and that's the keyword, transparently score that conversation, right? So for those types of algorithms, we use completely explainable and transparent algorithms, so that if there's a question of, okay, well, how come I was scored in this way, there's no black box. It's fully explainable, and you can trace it back to exactly why the algorithm decided to give you a 5 or a 7 or a 10, right?
Mhm.
So there's going to be situations where you want to be 100% transparent. There's going to be situations where it's okay to have a little bit of a black box there, still with the ability to override ultimately what the machine decided.
Mhm. What do you think is the very best use of the intelligence provided by Clarabridge platforms for companies?
Hmm, that's a good question. So the best, there are a few, but one that I think is very valuable. Um, we try to frame it very simply when we speak to customers or prospects, right? In the end, it's about business, right? So our technology has to save you money somehow, right? Through improved operations, uh, or it has to help you make money, right, through improved sales processes, or better product positioning or segmentation, or it has to help you reduce risk or liabilities, right? So for example, if our software helps you reduce the potential of government fines in a compliance use case, right, because language can be detected, then that's another area of ROI. So, is there within those three a better one? I don't know, but again, the way we try to frame it is always, okay, what's the value that we bring into a company, and we're going to help you again make money, save money, or reduce risk. Ideally, all three of them.
Cool. Pulling slightly away from Clarabridge, a little bit more into like you as a person or as an executive and as a professional. Do you ever get questions or maybe pushback from people because you work with artificial intelligence? Do you ever get the claim of artificial intelligence is stealing people's jobs and a future of hell and damnation? Do you get that?
We do, I do, and it's there's a lot of literature out there. I mean, you talked about Terminator, right? Basically,
Yeah.
AI is coming to take
So
over.
sci-fi-esque,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, take our jobs, rule the world, etc. And that's a way to see it, right? Of course, and there's no denying that there's certain areas where AI can look a little bit scary,
Hmm.
right? But at the same time, when applied properly, when applied ethically, it can be incredibly liberating, right? And so instead of doing repetitive, sometimes boring, work, suddenly can free you up, right? If I think of the contact center, for example, and you think of chatbot technology or that type of technology, is it taking jobs? Not necessarily, right? It's helping solve customer issues or prepare the customer for a conversation with a human. And then the human is not doing the same conversation every time. Hey, how do I change my password on the website, right? It gets boring at some point.
Yeah.
So if that can be solved through a self-service web page or a chatbot, then the human is still there, but is going to have much more meaningful, interesting human conversations with a customer, right? So uh, again, there's many ways to see it, but I think AI is a technology for the better in general.
Do you think that in the future, let's look a little bit into the future, not way out, because or else we'll just go down like a rabbit hole. But so you know how when surveys first started, like the whole idea of the 10-point scale or the 11-point scale,
Hmm.
and eventually customers learned how to manipulate surveys, so they know
Right.
that if they give a 10, or versus if they give a 0, et cetera. Do you think that at some point customers are going to learn how to manipulate an NLP, like by specifically saying certain words that trigger a response? Like, for instance,
Uh-huh.
I learned, my husband worked with call centers for a while. So he always gives me these pointers of which words to say. And normally it's like very inflammatory words that you use during like a contact center call that will
Uh-huh.
immediately like push you into a priority or urgency line to solve your problems quicker. And this is
Right.
like stuff that we learn as customers of like how to hack it. Do you think that that's going
Uh-huh.
to happen with NLP as well? Will people
I
eventually learn how to say certain words just to try to get some sort of advantage?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would imagine, we're clever and we try to beat the machine at its own game. So
Yeah.
I would imagine that there's going to be situations like that, and you know, I think of it even in the world of surveys, right? I mean, sometimes you go take your car to the shop, and after you get the service, the person tells you, "Hey, I need a 5 because blah blah blah," right? So it can go both ways. It's the person submitting the survey, but also the person on the other side um, trying to game the system as well. So we're human. It's part of what we do. We try to game the system and game the machine. So I would not be surprised if some clever hackers try to hack NLP as well.
We've been talking for 38 minutes now, and that really flew by.
It's
Um,
amazing. It was a fun conversation.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated, being a part of this world of bringing technology into customer experience. It's such a fascinating world, and I really think that we're on the right track of really making customers' lives easier by giving them. I'm not only going to say quicker access to things like you said with chatbots, where it just speeds up the process, but
Hmm.
also in finding ways to value customers' time and be respectful of their time by inquiring the least amount possible and maximizing that feedback. so that the companies are able to make good decisions that benefit customers' lives and give them a better experience as a whole.
Absolutely.
Without having to solicit these big, huge, long surveys that have, 35 questions and take, 45 minutes to accomplish. So I'm really happy at how much this industry is growing and pushing. And I'm glad to have companies like Clarabridge out there really working hard to make technology a part of customer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And what you guys are doing is also fascinating, right? As you say, it's trying to maximize the information that a company gets while minimizing the effort in the customer's part to provide that information. And it's the information that the customer is interested in providing, not what some analyst somewhere in a desk decided to put as a question. So I think we're doing the right things, right? Moving the industry forward, using technology to improve both the customer experience from a customer perspective, as well as with companies that want to dedicate effort to that as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Fabrice, if our listeners want to connect with you somehow to either continue the conversation or shoot you a question about something that you said, what's the best way to connect with you?
Oh, the best way to connect with me, and by the way, I would love to connect with folks who listen to this podcast. I'm always fascinated by these conversations, and I love nerding out on NLP and text analytics, as you saw. So LinkedIn is probably the best way. So it's
Awesome.
LinkedIn/Martin Fabrice. That's my link.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to wish you a wonderful day and wonderful holidays because we're nearing the end of 2020.
Yes.
And you are welcome to come on this podcast anytime and nerd out on NLP because I love it.
Love it. Thank you so much for hosting, Mary. This was a real pleasure, and happy holidays to you as well.
Thank you, Fabrice.
Take care.
That's our show. Thanks for joining us. We hope we've brought you one step closer to leading through empathy. It's our way of making the world a better place, one business at a time. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell if you want to know as soon as we publish a new episode. Voices of CX is brought to you by Worthix. I'm Mary Drummond. This podcast is hosted and produced by me, edited and co-produced by Steve Barry. See you next week.